Good evening. Delighted to see you all here. We have an extraordinary evening for all of you. I'd like to thank the members of the Baker Institute's Board of Advisors who are with us tonight and the members of our roundtable. It is your support for the Institute and the work that we do that allows us to have events like this and the rest of the program, which I know benefits you, the people of Houston, Texas, and the nation. I'd like to start by introducing the first of our guests, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. Kurt is the 22nd Deputy Secretary of State. Prior to assuming this position, Kurt served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs on the National Security Council. He was founding Chairman and CEO of the Asia Group. Now, Kurt has served many roles focused upon the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, as it was referred to at an earlier point, including Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, CEO of the Center for a New American Security, Director of the Aspen Strategy Group, and Chairman of the Editorial Board of the Washington Quarterly. Kurt has also been Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs, White House Fellow at the Treasury Department, and Director of the Democracy Office during the Clinton administration of the NSC. He is literally the Asia czar, as the press refers to him, for the administration. Please welcome him. Our other guest tonight is Jon Finer. He is President Biden's Principal Deputy National Security Advisor. Prior to joining the White House staff, he was an adjunct senior fellow for foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Chief of Staff and Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State for John Kerry. He also worked for 4 years at the White House as senior advisor to then Deputy National Security Advisor Tony Blinken. Jon was also special advisor for the Middle East and North Africa and foreign policy speechwriter for now President Biden. Prior to his government service, most importantly, Jon was a foreign and national correspondent. For the Washington Post, he spent 18 months covering the war in Iraq as an embedded journalist with the U.S. Marines during the 2003 campaign. He has also covered earlier conflicts in Gaza, Russia, Georgia, and Israel, Lebanon. He is not the only specialist, however, in international conflicts. He has also covered the 2004 presidential campaign and the 2004 Major League Baseball playoffs. So a familiar face in deeply, deeply contested situations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jon Finer. Jon and I also, truth in lending here, worked closely together for most of the past 13 months on the situation in the Middle East, principally on Gaza. And Jon, it's delighted to have you back here today as opposed to seeing you on a video screen at late hours of the night in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. Kurt, welcome to the Institute. Jon, I'm going to start with you. There are 5 weeks left in the administration. A lot has happened in the past few weeks, it seems. Syria, Kurt, South Korea, lots of developments. It never stands still. President is president until January 20th at noon. I'd very much welcome your thoughts on looking back. Challenges, the opportunities, successes, non-successes, where you see this administration leaving things, and what the next administration is going to face.
Great. Thank you, David. And before I answer that very good question, I do want to say thanks to you and to the Baker Institute for having us, and parochially to you for the work that you did in our administration, and many before that. I won't say how many, but really grateful on one of the hardest jobs we had, which is the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I will confess I am probably not the most unbiased person to assess the work of this administration over the last 4 years on foreign policy, and probably we are still too close and too enmeshed in that work to offer a dispassionate analysis. But I will say a few things. I think the metrics that we think about, by the metrics that we think about most intensively at the NSC, we will be handing off, in my view, a very strong hand in the world to our successors. First and foremost, we have strengthened the sources of America's power and influence in the world through several seminal pieces of legislation that have been passed on a bipartisan basis in the course of this administration to strengthen the United States industrial base, our economy, our infrastructure, our technological edge. In a time when, let's just say, it's not easy to get big pieces of legislation through Congress, this administration has done it not once, not twice, but several times, and left the country stronger because of that. Second, in terms of our relationships in the world, in the Indo-Pacific, which has been mentioned, where we have upgraded and enhanced our trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea, where we have improved our relations with Vietnam and Indonesia and the countries of ASEAN, where the U.S. India relationship has never been in a stronger place, and Kurt and I spent a lot of time with some Indian astronauts today over at the Johnson Space Center, space cooperation being just one area where we've deepened our ties to India. In Europe, where NATO is more central, more essential, stronger, and larger than it has been at any point since the end of the Cold War. And in other parts of the world as well, we think we will be handing off very strong relationships with our partners and allies to the next administration. And when you look at that same balance sheet on the part of our adversaries, Russia, bogged down and mired in a terrible war in Ukraine and paying an enormous cost. Iran, now after more than a year since the horrific October 7th attacks, on the back foot in the Middle East with its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, badly diminished, its ally, Assad, having been swept away from Syria. Those countries are also not on their strongest footing, and I could go through the rest of the list, including China, which I suspect Kurt will have more to say about. So by those three standards, which are not the only standards, but which we think are essential to assessing kind of the overall state of play in the world, we will be handing off, I think, a very strong hand. There are conflicts still raging in the Middle East and in Europe. That is not lost on us. But I do think we have set the next administration up to have those conflicts in a far better place during the course of 2025. And if so, that will be largely, I think, because of the work that's gone into the last 4 years.
We'll be coming back to some of the conflict areas, some of those opportunities in a moment. But Kurt, your focus here in Houston was the meetings focused on India, Indian space program. This administration has revitalized, energized the Indo-Pacific Quad, Japan, Australia, U.S., and India, I think to the greatest extent in its, 20-year history. India, critical partner, great deal of attention focused upon India. China, critical challenge. Coups in South Korea. Japan, changes in government. Talk to us about the Indo-Pacific.
Great. Well, first of all, David, can I just say thank you very much for hosting us today. It's great to be at RISE. We've had a really special set of interactions with our Indian interlocutors and had a chance to visit the Space Center and a number of deeply and powerfully innovative American firms that are seeking to build partnerships with countries like India as we look at space opportunities for exploration and potential manufacturing. So really an exciting day, and it's great to top it off by being here. So when President Biden came to power, I think one of the things he tried to instill on his staff, Jon and I were some of the first folks in at the National Security Council, I think a recognition that, look, you both have worked a lot on the challenges that we face in the Middle East and South Asia, and they are continuing to grapple with us. But as we look over the horizon, I think the recognition is the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to play out in the Indo-Pacific. These are the dynamic economies, enormous innovation, huge populations, lots of churn and possibility. And I think at the beginning of the administration, the president said, look, we're going to have to start to reorient more of our capabilities and our focus towards the Indo-Pacific, created an office. John and our national security advisor entrusted me and asked me to help sort of play a role to start thinking, David, about how to ensure that we are putting together consequential strategies that would lift American possibilities and potential in the Indo-Pacific. And I will say that when we look back on this period, it's hard to remember it at this time, but 4 years ago we were mired in really deep uncertainty in COVID. There was a sense that our economy had been badly damaged. There was a belief that China was just on a rocket ship, that everyone believed that this was the future, and frankly, many of our interlocutors in Beijing believed that the United States was in hurtling decline. And you just look at that period 4 years later, look, there's lots of anxieties in the United States about our economy and inflation, but I can tell you, and I think John can underscore this, if you travel the world, our economy is the envy of the world. Frankly, it is by far and away the strongest of any industrialized democracy. It is also the case that China has now faced really substantial headwinds, and so I think our fortunes have somewhat shifted. And as John has indicated, I do think we turn over our position in this global competition to a new administration with the United States in a much stronger position than just a few years ago. And the elements of our strength and power that John has articulated are clear, much more focused on technology. Friends, the commanding heights of the competition with China will really be in areas like 5G, AI, quantum computing, and there is a deeper recognition of the importance of these capabilities. And I will tell you, places like Rice, industrial parks here are leading the way for the United States. It is also the case, as John indicates, I don't know a period in which our partnerships are stronger. I've seen what's taken place in NATO. It's really remarkable, but also building, as David indicates, stronger partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, the 4 maritime democracies. They met first almost 20 years ago in the H.W. Bush administration. They met after the tragedy of the Indonesian tsunami. Frankly, met very little since then. It was President Biden who said, look, let's try to get the band back together. Since that point, 3.5 years ago, the Quad has met almost 6 times. Huge amount of engagement on a variety of issues of mutual interest in climate change and disease and a host of areas of cooperation. One of the reasons we're here is to talk about space. I will say that I am quite gratified at our ability to work together. As David indicates, some turbulence in South Korea, but I will say what we have seen over the last couple of weeks, fingers crossed, constitutional mechanisms appear to be holding, and our determination is to stand closely by our South Korean partners as they go through a challenging period. So I would say, David, one of the things that is going to be central as we go forward, there are clearly going to be pressing issues in Europe and in the Middle East and South Asia, but ultimately we are going to have to recognize that more capacity, more engagement is going to have to be directed towards the rising challenges that will really define the 21st century as we go forward.
Kurt, you just mentioned a word that I was going to raise with you, capacity. We've had folks here at the Institute, both sides of the aisle, all points on the spectrum of how you deal with China. Broadly speaking, regard this administration's policies as pretty much the right way to go, but lacking capacity to actually implement. How would you respond?
So look, David, one of the things that all of us share, the three of us, is that we've served with some degree of pride at the State Department. It's an institution that we all love. What we have inside the U.S. government is essentially one institution that is on steroids. It's our military. We've just put an enormous amount of capacity into that. That is appropriate, by the way. But many of our other institutions are almost existing on life support, and the State Department is one of every year fighting for our budgets. I'm struck by, for us to be effective, David, increasingly on the global stage, we're going to have to more effectively make the case to the American people about why forward, engaged, optimistic America, represented in all our key institutions, whether it's our aid institutions or our diplomacy, is in the interests of the American people. I will say one of the things that I'm struck by in many of my conversations on Capitol Hill is that we have not been able to make a convincing argument that American engagement serves the interests of the American people, not the elites that live on the corridors, but the people that inhabit main streets across the United States. I think one of the things that, we're coming to the end of our tenure. I think these periods leave you with questions and things that you want to explore. I want to try to think more deeply about how to make the case that internationalism and engagement in the world is in the best interest of the United States, and that when we look inside and when we become selfish and focused on our narrow interests, it's not good for us and it's not good for the world. But I do not believe we've made that case effectively, David, to be honest.
And it would not be the first administration
No, it's
to come to that judgment.
And I will say that this is not a partisan observation.
Yep.
Our greatest internationalists of the last 50 years are people like Jim Baker, who have served on both sides of the aisle, but probably on the Republican side. And so my hope is that we'll be able to rally a strong group of people that understand the nature of American purpose abroad.
So, John, challenges. Kurt's got plenty of them. But looking outside of China, Russia, Putin, and Russia, Ukraine. Where does it go? And as you look back, could it have gone to a different place with different decisions earlier? Retrospective gazes are always 2020 focused, but where are we now? What can be done to change a direction in Ukraine to avoid a Putin victory through attrition?
So I'd say a few things about that. It's first of all the right set of questions, and I think these questions are increasingly going to be asked in the weeks and months to come, including because there's going to be a transition of administration, and I and many others I think are very eager to see how the new and incoming administration chooses to address these issues. I'll leave it to them to articulate their approach, and I won't really speculate about it. But what I will say is, it is important, I think, in thinking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, to put yourself back in the mindset of January and February of 2022. The United States was going around the world, including going to Ukraine, and telling everybody this invasion was coming. There was a lot of skepticism, I think, in the United States about whether we were right about that. There was a lot of skepticism in the rest of the world about whether we were right about that. But once it became clear that Russia was not only saber-rattling, but fully intended to go into Ukraine, and in a different way from how they had invaded before, with the full intention of trying to take as much of the country as they could by force, the best assessments inside our government, outside our government, among experts who followed this issue very closely, were that Russia would dominate that conflict, do so in relatively short order, and that Ukraine could fall in a matter of days, if not weeks.
I remember the assessments.
And the reality was very different. First and foremost, and it's important to acknowledge this because everybody underestimated the capability, and beyond the capability, the sheer sort of force of will of the people of Ukraine, who stood up and fought back and defended their country and pushed Russia back to the outer reaches of eastern Ukraine. But they also were able to do that because the United States and our partners and allies stood up and provided Ukraine in real time and before the conflict, but also as the conflict unfolded, with every capability that they needed to be able to wage that fight. So the reality is, here we are now more than 2 years later in a situation where our priority in the waning days of this administration is to surge as much, and the president has been very clear about this, materiel into Ukraine as we can get before the end of this time, before the end of this administration, and we are doing that, including every possible capability that the Ukrainians have asked for. That's one. Second, to get them the funding support that they need to be able to not have Russia totally crush their economy, which is another goal that the Russians have. And we just transferred $20 billion, and this is important, not of U.S. taxpayer funding into Ukraine, but of funding that is drawn from the proceeds of seized Russian assets in the United States and Europe. That money was made available to the Ukrainians just last week through a mechanism in the World Bank, and Ukraine will be able to draw on that funding going forward into 2025. Look, it's both appropriate and understandable to have strong views about these issues. I don't have any problem with that. But I do think this is not a war where it is debatable who is in the right and who is in the wrong. There are wars like that that exist in the world, but in this case, Russia invaded a sovereign country, its neighbor, which is a member of the United Nations and has every right to exist with full sovereignty inside its own borders, and can't do that because Russia's invaded. So anyway, back to where this leaves us. So we are getting as much material as we can into Ukraine. We are getting them the financial support that they need, in part drawing on these Russian reserves, and we are increasing sanctions pressure on Russia so that they feel the full consequence and cost of the decision that President Putin has made to launch this invasion. Now, the war is not going to be over by the end of this administration. But Ukraine, we believe, is in a strong position, and the goal that we have had from the very beginning is not to tell Ukraine when it is time to negotiate the end of this war. Ultimately, we believe this war will have to end through negotiations, as almost all wars do. But that will be up to the Ukrainians to decide. Our policy and our role is to put them in the strongest possible position to be able to succeed in that negotiation, preserve their sovereignty, preserve their territorial integrity when they choose to do so. And it will be up to the next administration to decide whether to continue that approach.
Can I say one of the things on that, David? Just I will say wars, I first very much agree with what Jon says. These conflicts can be quite clarifying. And I will say one of the things that's happened is that the two countries that have supported Russia the most, one more quietly and one quite directly now, are China and North Korea. China has provided remarkable support to Russia's defense industrial base. And that partnership between Putin and Xi is something that we're really going to have to watch. It's an issue of concern. But we're also seeing North Korean troops for the first time come across the giant landmass of Eurasia to serve side by side with Russians against the Ukrainians. So it is a dangerous set of encounters. I will say that the focus that the president has put on this and the unity we have seen in Europe, no one would have anticipated that 3 years ago. And it's quite remarkable. And the hope will be that this unity will be able to pull us through, and we will be able to stand by a Ukraine that remains free and able to make its own decisions in the world.
For both of you, critical question, which is really central to that presentational issue for the American people. Why does the outcome matter? Jon, you want to take that first?
Sure. And honestly, this is an argument I think that matters and should matter not just to the American people, but to people in other countries in the world, including countries that have not really taken a side in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It should not be the case in 2024 that one country that is larger and stronger can simply redraw the borders of another country because it chooses to do that, and because it can. That is not something the American people should countenance, even though we are a strong country. And that is not something that other countries, including some that themselves could fall victim to exactly this sort of might makes right mindset in international affairs, should subject themselves to. Yes, it's morally wrong. It's also dangerous, I think. Dangerous to basic security and stability in the world. And the United States, as a country that ever since the end of World War II, has stood for a few basic principles. First and foremost, basic principle of sovereignty among nations, and which all other members of the United Nations have signed up to, should believe in as well. That isn't a hard argument. And what's interesting is when you go around the world and talk to countries, even those that basically don't really have a view of how the war should end, they just want it to be over. When you lay out the argument, should Ukraine have to give up territory because Russia took it? Almost none of them will say that the answer to that country is yes. The answer to that question is yes.
And Kurt, China, the relationship with Putin, a reversal of fortune of the modern history of China. Russia's the demander of China. How does Ukraine's fate factor into Xi's calculus as he projects his power and influence?
David, it's a great question. One of the things you might want to take a look at, in the days before the Beijing Winter Olympics, right before the invasion, Russia and China put out a manifesto of sorts that really was a vision of how they wanted to conduct their relations going forward. And if you actually read it, David, and go through it, it has elements that are quite chilling. It is a combination of almost sort of 1950s elements of ideology, sort of kind of the hard red period of driving forward, sort of a purposeful determination of these two countries, Russia still remembering its communist past, and a 1930s ambition of territorial acquisition. And it's quite dangerous and quite chilling. And I completely agree with Jon. If we stand for anything in the world, it has to be to resist that kind of might makes right, and the idea that a big country can swallow up a little one. I will tell you one of the reasons why many countries, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, to bring us back to earlier questions that David posed, have decided to basically work with us and with Europe is because of the very fact that they understand the risks of what the lessons of success would be in the Indo-Pacific, not just for places like Taiwan, but other countries as well. When we were working hard to pass the supplemental, which was delayed for months and it was difficult and uncertain, Jon and I and the president, we were hosting the Japanese Prime Minister for a state visit, and he was given an opportunity to address both houses of Congress. And this is Prime Minister Kishida. In that speech that he gave to Congress, I think all of our Congress, our senators and congressmen, expected a speech about the U.S.-Japan relationship, about the Indo-Pacific. But instead, Prime Minister Kishida made a fervent, passionate appeal to pass the supplemental because it was in Japan's interest to see that other countries and the United States stood squarely behind the Ukrainian people. And in fact, once that bill passed, if you ask many congressmen, they will say what turned their minds, what made them persuaded, was the appeal of countries outside of Europe that understood the risks. And so, David, I would say that these are extraordinarily challenging times. And I do agree with David, with Jon. We find many areas of ambiguity that you have to make hard choices in global politics. I see very little sign of this here. This is a black and white situation. And when you interact with Ukrainian counterparts and other frontline states in the Balts and in Scandinavia and in Poland, you cannot help but be inspired by that. And I will say, when you look back, when you're asking Jon about accomplishments, I had not worked very much on NATO before I took this job at the State Department. It is a remarkable institution, remarkable. And to see countries like Finland and Sweden, who jealously guarded their sovereignty and didn't want to join NATO, choose to decide to join NATO, making it that much stronger. And they decided to join frankly, because of their confidence in Joe Biden. And so my hope will be that when we have an opportunity to reflect back on this, the truth is the organization, the institution is stronger. We're in a better position to support Ukraine. And I do believe that there are people that we have enormous confidence in Senator Rubio, others that are coming in that stand for American purpose on the global stage. And we believe and hope they'll be resolute in this time of their need.
Kurt, strategic importance of India.
So look, I mean, we were talking about it as we were coming over, making our way here, and how exciting it is to see. Like, India now is the largest country in the world, largest population. If you look at your campuses here, the largest number of students from any country studying in the United States are now Indians. The importance of the diaspora community, I don't need to tell friends from Houston. I would say that it is, if not the most, among the most important relationships for us in the 21st century. I am struck at the dynamism that exists in every element of our relationship. You talked about the Quad, but it transcends that, David. It's in technology. One of the things that I think the NSC has done, I really commend Jake and John on this, is the work that they've done to ensure that technology is at the core of what we're doing together. We're cooperating more militarily, educationally. Most of the interlocutors that we deal with in the Indian government are very bullish about working with the United States. At the core of our relationship for decades was a kind of mistrust and uncertainty, both for where we were, where they were. I think most of that has really passed from the scene. I'll give you, if I can, David, it's not that funny of a story. It's important to me. I had worked for years in trying to build a stronger relationship with Indian partners when I was at the State Department. In your kind introduction back in the Obama administration, we started to have dialogues with India about the Indo-Pacific. India is in South Asia, but has real interests in the Indo-Pacific. And so at that juncture, we were having kind of quiet, almost secret talks. My counterpart was a wonderful, distinguished Brahmin gentleman that was trained in an environment that was deeply skeptical of the United States. And so I remember we were having these meetings, they were going on. Every appeal I had to work together, he would parry or thrust or move away, and I was getting more and more frustrated. And so pretty much at the end of the dialogue, I said, you know, I'm going to tell you something that's really going to make you angry. And he grabbed his chair and I said, we're destined to be closer friends in the future. And it was like a knife in his heart. And so I saw him last year and I reminded him that he'd completely forgotten. But the truth is, we are working much closer on the global stage. I'm excited and ambitious about the future of the U.S. India relationship.
That's great. And John, much as it pains me to do so, I am obliged. The Middle East, where never a silver lining without a cloud, where good ideas and great policies go to perish. But some extraordinary developments, not just what happened in Syria in those amazing 12 days, but why it happened. A diminished Hezbollah, a diminished Iran, and a diminished Russia. There's some opportunities here. Potential for a Saudi deal, further normalization, and a further way of setting back Chinese ambitions in the region. Ceasefire, of course, with release of hostages in Gaza. Tell me how you look at both those challenges, but also the opportunities.
Thank you, David. And you may or may not remember this, but I think even though we worked together in two different administrations now, I believe we first met in Iraq when I was a reporter and you were playing a diplomatic role. And so I feel like I've been at this for a long time in the Middle East, which is hard to say the least. I know you've been at it a lot longer. And I agree with everything that you said in your question. Look, you cannot deny that it has been a tragic, horrific, maddening last 14 months in this region, starting, and the story has to start here, with the absolutely appalling attacks that took place on October 7th and the more than 1,000 lives that were lost in Israel on that day. Ever since then, the events have unfolded that if just one of them had taken place, it would have dominated headlines in a normal year, and we've had a series of them, it feels like almost every month in the region over the last 14 months. We are now in a place, largely I think for the reasons that you just described, where there is the real possibility of a sort of a better near-term future. In large part because there has been this strategic realignment in the region, starting with the fact that Iran, which played such a dominant role in so many countries in the region, much to many of their chagrin, has been diminished because, as you said, and as I argued a bit earlier, its primary proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, have been weakened during the course of its fight with Israel. Russia and Iran were unable to come to Assad's defense, and Assad was removed from power in Syria. And I do want to pause on Syria for just 1 minute, because I know that Mark Tice is here. And Mark is somebody I've known now for 12 years. Mark and Deborah, Austin Tice's parents. Before I say anything more about policy, I do just want to underscore that the United States has no higher priority in the current moment in Syria than trying through every means we have, including direct conversations with the people who are now playing a role of responsibility in Syria, to gather information that can lead to us finding Austin and returning to his family. So I did want to say that because I saw you there, Mark. But because of the developments that I've just described, because Iran is now increasingly on the back foot, because Israel, our ally, is in a position of greater strength, because there has now been this ceasefire achieved between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, there is the possibility, finally, after this horrific period of calming things down, and the big exception still at this moment is Gaza. And again, on Gaza, it must be acknowledged that even though Hamas perpetrated the crimes of October 7th, there has been extraordinary suffering among the people who live in Gaza, the vast majority of whom had absolutely nothing to do with those events since then. That there have been far too many lives lost and far too many people whose lives have been destroyed, even if they have survived this period. And so it has been a priority of this administration to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We spend an extraordinary amount of time on that task, which is challenging for any number of reasons. Our view is that the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, and in some ways maybe also the new situation with regard to the government in Syria, has given new energy, new momentum to the possibility at least of a deal that will finally end the war in Gaza, bring the hostages home who have been living in unimaginable conditions in Gaza, and start to put the region in a much more stable place. I cannot predict here exactly what timeline or whether that will transpire, but there is the possibility, and the circumstances that I just described, including this strategic realignment, has put us in the place to pursue that goal.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
We have many questions from the audience. I'll try to summarize them. There's some very good ones here. For both of you, but with particular attention to China and India, militarization of space, technical militarization, different ways to confront, supporting allies and friends, confronting the prevalence of industrial espionage and flow of technologies to adversaries. What's the best mix of things to do?
David, there are a lot of issues there. Let me just say, I do believe, we face in the weeks and months ahead some foundational questions. I do believe that most Americans think that the United States is better off with closer, deeper partnerships. And to achieve that in the world today requires a deepening of cooperation in technology, in intelligence, in military cooperation across the board. And so what I think John and I and others have tried to do in recent years is to advance those relationships in ways that put it on an equal footing. I think some of our relationships historically had been, huge power imbalances. The United States is the big brother, the larger power. I think we're seeking to work with countries in a greater sense of partnership. I think we share a sense of what we want to preserve. I do want to underscore, sometimes you hear a discussion that when countries like the United States and India or Japan are working together, that this is somehow aimed at constricting or constraining China. I do not believe that that is the case at all. In fact, I think what you're seeing increasingly are countries that believe that there is an operating system that has been developed over decades that has been quite favorable to all of us, that has advanced knowledge, that has helped support innovation and business and exchange, and that there's a desire to sustain that. And it has come under some challenge by countries like China and Russia, and that the best way to do that is to work more closely with allies and partners. And that means working with them in space, in technology, across the board. I do not believe, David, that this means militarizing. I do think it is critical to understand that many of the areas that we're seeking to support in these interactions are peaceful, they're about educational exchange, they're about cultural interactions. And in fact, those are the things, the fabric of our relationships on the global stage today. Ultimately, though, I do think what is clear is the world is an extraordinarily dangerous and uncertain place. And so we have to be vigilant, and we have to be committed to sustaining partnerships, because it is through those partnerships we put ourselves in a better set of circumstances.
Quick question that we get a lot here. How's the administration dealt with the BRICS?
So I guess I'd say a few things. The United States has bilateral relationships, including very close ones, with a number of the kind of core BRICS members. We've been talking about India right here today. We have built, during the course of this administration, or strengthened a number of these, what we call sometimes, it's a terrible term, mini-lats. What we mean by that are small configurations of countries that are like-minded, that can work together on core issues. Kurt mentioned the Quad, I mentioned the U.S., Japan, and the Republic of Korea, and there are a number of these others. One thing that we have been very clear about in trying to deepen our partnerships with other countries, either country to country or in these small groupings, is that we don't see these as exclusive arrangements. We don't see working with the United States as meaning you cannot work with X, Y, or Z other country. What we are trying to present countries with is a value proposition that says, if you partner with the United States, there is a lot in that for you. We believe, frankly, there is a lot in that for us. So we make our case everywhere we go around the world. In our own hemisphere, in Latin America, in Africa, where the president just made a visit to Angola, a country that during the Cold War, the United States fought on the opposite side of the Soviet Union in a horrific civil war, and is now moving further and further away from Russia towards the direction of the United States, in large part because we have built an investment-based relationship with them that is leading to a project that is going to link the countries of Southern Africa with a railroad that will start in Angola and proceed all the way to Tanzania. That is the kind of big, ambitious project driven by both the government and the private sector that only the United States can bring to bear because of the dynamism of our private sector and the investment that so many countries around the world are seeking. That's what's in it for these countries, and nobody went to Angola and said, if you do this with us, you cannot do X, Y, and Z with Russia or China. They are coming in our direction because they see what's in it for them. There are, though, and I think this is also important, a few core exceptions to what I just laid out. And it goes to what Kurt described earlier with these core technologies that are of tremendous value from the perspective of a national security. There are going to be times when the United States says, if you want to cooperate with us on these most sensitive technologies, whether it's 5G or AI or quantum, advanced semiconductors, then that has to be a relationship of some exclusivity, because it is not in our interest and we cannot allow it to be the case that the United States provides and cooperates on technology with countries who hand those technologies to our adversaries. That is an area of exception. Broadly, though, the United States is not zero-sum about the relationship we have with other countries in the world, and I think that is another thing that distinguishes us from some of the countries we compete with.
Dave, can I say one thing? I, again, very much align myself with what Jon said. I do think we need to recognize, though, that the challenge for the next administration and those that will follow is that if you look at a country, Jon mentioned the president going to Angola, in 5 to 7 years, 40% of the world's population will be in Africa. And so we have an enormous opportunity, but also challenge to lift our game there, and that there are hearts and minds that we need to work on. And I will say there are remarkable programs and opportunities, like what Jon has described is the Lobita corridor, which is ambitious, and it's in infrastructure. But there are a number of other programs that sometimes we don't get as much credit for. They're not the big buildings of the kind that China has featured in its sort of Belt and Road approach. But for instance, the work that the Bush administration did to try to deal with AIDS in Africa, the PEPFAR program, is a remarkable achievement. And the irony is probably our best health initiative of modern times. We are relentlessly trying to raise money for that. It is a foundational part of our foreign policy, and it's been extraordinarily important, but there are elements in our Congress that think, well, gee, that's not that important to us anymore. I do think we're going to need to realize that the hearts and minds, that when David asked about the BRICS, it is true, yes, we do have good bilateral relations with many of those countries that are joining and associated, but we have to understand that there is a struggle, and we are going to need to step up our game here and do more with other countries and recognize the potential and how huge markets, huge innovation will play out in the African continent and elsewhere. And so sometimes we have focused a lot today in our discussions on Asia and the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Very developed and important, and we've done well there. But I think we need to recognize that, again, as I said, stepping up our game in the global south is really what lies immediately ahead.
Jon, final question for you. Most significant achievement of the administration with respect to U.S. economic interests abroad?
It's a very good question. My answer to that question is actually grounded in what 2-3 years ago you might have said could be something that caused us challenges abroad, which is the passage of what is somewhat misleadingly, although accurately, called the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, this is a major U.S. government expenditure to try to revitalize our manufacturing base, and in particular, our clean energy manufacturing base. A number of countries around the world, when the United States passed this law, saw it as a challenge or as a threat to them, because they saw the United States investing in our own native industries in a way that could give us a major advantage over these industries in their countries. And by the way, that was part of the goal, particularly part of the goal vis-a-vis certain countries that we have talked about quite a lot today, China, which has over many years, if not decades, engaged in what we believe to be significantly unfair trade practices that have advantaged its own industries. This was the United States fighting back and defending this critically important area of the future of the global economy and our own industrial base. But what we saw from like-minded countries after a while, when they started to dig in and understand what the United States Congress had done in passing this legislation, is they saw an opportunity, one, for them to get in on some of these deals, and there are ways built into the legislation for them to do that, and two, a tactic and approach for them to emulate. And we have strongly encouraged like-minded countries to do that, to make investments in their own sources of strength and resilience. Because for the United States, we cannot do this entirely on our own. We cannot have our entire supply chain be domestic. We are going to need to rely on like-minded countries, and we are going to need to make our own supply chains more resilient and not as dependent on countries that will not be reliable in a time of crisis, and that means strengthening our partners and allies economically as we strengthen ourselves. That is part of the theory of the case of the IRA, and I think countries have come to realize that.
Kurt, last for you. So long as Xi holds power in China, as he does today, is China, in fact, essentially an implacable adversary?
So, David, I think we have to be careful and temper that kind of ultimate conclusion. And so I don't mind confessing, every single one of my daughters has lived and studied in China. When they want to tell secrets behind the backs of their parents, they talk in Chinese. There are tremendous connections between the Chinese people and the world, and there is important work that needs to be done. And so one of the things that the president has always told us is, look, we have to compete. We have to compete. We have to show that we're prepared to stand up for what we believe in and for, you know, our values and our interests. But at the same time, we must do that with our hands open. And so you have seen areas of important collaboration. John had the great good fortune to work, as did you, David, with Secretary Kerry. I watched him with purpose and determination engage on the central issue of our time, which is climate change. This cannot be dealt with unless we have some kind of partnership or alignment with China. We have been beset by a horrible plague of drugs. One of the things that the president instructed us to do is deal with fentanyl, and we have sought to do that with engagement with China more directly. I think there are a number of areas. I'll give you one example. We understand the risks and the potentials of AI. You might not have seen, but our two countries have agreed to take careful steps to ensure that AI will never be used in nuclear decision making that could risk global peace and stability. There is more work that we can potentially do together. And I do believe ultimately, David, that China and the leadership are a pragmatic people. And the most important thing that we can do to keep peace is to demonstrate that our society, that our democracy, that our purpose remains strong, and that's our hope that will be continued. Can I just give you one last thing that you're talking about, and I agree with John said about what to be proud of and what's been accomplished. For me, one of the things that John and I have worked on, others, two of our closest friends in the world are Japan and South Korea. John talked about this. The challenge is, as strong as our bilateral partnerships are, the tension and the historical rift between these two countries is real. It's painful and it's evident. Despite that, the president instructed us from the first days of the administration to do everything possible to work behind the scenes with empathy, with a degree of patience, with a recognition of how hard it would be to try to bridge the gap between these two great civilizations. And I will say that I saw what the president did with tremendous care, making the occasional call, encouraging leaders and groups on both sides to try to find common purpose. And I had the great good fortune to be at Camp David, when our three countries met to try to track a future together and to see a different future, not only between the United States and these two countries, but between South Korea and Japan together. And I will say, you know, David has asked us a lot of questions about the hardness and the challenges in the world, and they are real. But there are moments in these jobs when you are lifted, when you are reminded about the possibility of rapprochement, of reaching across the differences and the difficulties of history. I'll just conclude with this. I remember I had never been really to Camp David before, and I was driving one of those little carts. My job was to go to the helicopter the president had given each of the leaders of the country, the Marine One, so that they could fly, and then we would have this meeting there. And I was driving in my cart to pick up the Japanese, and the Japanese diplomats are a very serious bunch. They do not joke around. They're very, they take their jobs very seriously. But as I was coming around the corner and the helicopter was landing, these very distinguished diplomats with decades of experience were all getting out of the helicopter and doing these leaping high fives. And of course they did that, but once I got there, they were carefully all then put back together again. But I often think we have tough days in these jobs, and there are moments where you are reminded that service comes with burden. But there are also times where you can look and say, this is what we're seeking, to bring people, democracies, people of goodwill together, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished there. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you both for coming here. You are both extraordinary public servants. You and so many others that we have all worked with over the years have devoted their lives both to the burden and to the service necessary to address that burden for the sake of the American people.
Could we also I know John would want to say this as well. I came late, but I saw it. You should know what an incredible person that you have in David. You have no idea the work that he put in, and he has served his nation with distinction, and you guys are lucky to have him here.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thanks for the plug for diplomacy and engagement.
Good, thank you.